Good evening from where you are listening to this podcast and around the world to the final episode for now of the African Football Podcast. So as you know, or before I get to that point with myself, Kwame, Ghanaian writer, broadcaster, journalist, historian, podcast and entrepreneur. And in this week's edition of African Football Podcast, why so many Africans play for European teams like the Netherlands, England, France, etc. All right, so this is the last, obviously we've been doing African Football Podcast towards the duration of this World Cup. And by the time you listen to this podcast, the World Cup final will be over because it's going to be featured Spain, who beat France in the first semi-final, against Argentina, who beat England in the second final. So the final will be on Sunday, July 19th, between Spain and Argentina to see who will be crowned champions. So when this podcast comes out on Monday, the final will be over. So I'm not going to put my bets as to who's going to win that. But nonetheless to say, we've been doing a lot of podcasts over the last month, duration of the World Cup. And it's been, like I said, last weekend. It's been a great tournament for Africa, African teams participating in the World Cup. But this podcast essentially is about why many Africans, obviously they are Africans, they're black, they got woolly hair, king rose, cornrow, kinky hair. Why is it that these Africans are playing for, England, France, the Netherlands, Germany, Spain, etc., as opposed to playing for Ghana, Nigeria, DR Congo, Cameroon, etc. Okay, so we're going to delve into this. So before we get into the show, as usual, if you like what you hear, please share it to your friends, your family, your social media networks. Subscribe to Ghana African Focus on YouTube. Hit the notification bell, meaning that every time we upload a new podcast, YouTube will notify you of that. Also, we are on Spotify. Look out for Ghana African Focus on Spotify. Hit the follow button, meaning that every time we upload a new podcast on Spotify, you'll be notified by Spotify. And for that matter, we are on all of the major podcast providers. So anywhere where you get your podcast from, just look out for Ghana African Focus. All right, so let's get into this podcast today, looking at why many African, heritage players represent, teams like England, France, Germany, etc., instead of the countries their families come from. So this isn't necessarily about football, even though it has a football theme. It's about history, imperialism, migration, identity, prestige, politics, and the phase of African football federations. So let's break it down properly. So to understand why Africans, play for European teams, you must understand the colonial migration routes. So European empires created the modern African diaspora. So a country like France colonized large chunks of West Africa that include modern-day Senegal, Mali, Guinea, Ivory Coast, Congo, Brazzaville, DR Congo, etc., with many Africans communities in places like Paris, Marseille, and Lyon. Britain colonized countries like, again, along the west coast of Africa, countries like Ghana, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, meaning that you've got strong African communities in London, in Birmingham, in Manchester, and Nottingham. The Portuguese colonized Angola, Cape Verde, Guinea Bissau. So you have because of that, you have a huge African diaspora in Lisbon and Porto. Belgium, as we all know, colonized the Congo. So there are big Congolese communities in Brussels and also Antwerp. The Netherlands didn't have any major African colonies although they had one, South Africa, but that's another story. But they essentially colonized Suriname. Suriname is a country in South America, okay? And because of that, and also Curaçao, but more to be Suriname. And so because of this, there are huge Suriname communities in Amsterdam and Rotterdam. So these communities didn't appear randomly. They came, or these communities came because of the forced migration that was created by the aftermath of imperialism. Yeah. And again, post-war migration and economic pull factors. So when you see people like Kylian Mbappe, yeah, Bukayo Saka, Jude Bellingham, Jamal Musiala, Romelu Lukaku, Memphis Depay, Fernandez, and Manuel Akanji, what you're seeing essentially is a legacy of empire. Yeah. So you're not just seeing Africans playing for those European teams like the Netherlands, England, etc. What you're seeing is the legacy of empire. And those people who come and say, oh, Saka can't play for English, yeah, that's empire. You colonize Saka's parents' country, Nigeria. So that's a legacy. So Saka playing for England, right, is a legacy of empire. Let's move on. Migration and citizenship. So many African players, heritage players in Europe, are born in Europe, yeah? So they're born in England, like Saka. Saka was born in England. He was born in Nigeria. Mbappe was born in France. He wasn't born in Cameroon. He has a Cameroonian father and an Algerian mother, yeah? Michael Olise, yeah, he was born in London, England. He wasn't born in Nigeria. Romelu Lukaku, he wasn't born in DR Congo, born in Belgium, yeah? So these Africans are born in Europe, raised in Europe, educated in Europe, they're trained in European academies, and they're citizens of those European countries like Britain, France, Germany, the Netherlands, etc. So the reason why they were born, the reason why people like Saka, Mbappe, etc., were born in those European countries is that their parents migrated, and there was a big migration post-Second World War into Europe because a lot of Europeans died. I'm talking white Europeans died in that Second World War, so-called Second World War. So the European powers, i.e. Britain, Germany, France, Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, Belgium, they needed labor, yeah, that would rebuild these countries after the Second World War. So it's not just in England where you got a Windrush. In every European country, France, Germany, Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, etc., right, you got a Windrush, yeah? So the parents of the likes of Saka and Mbappe, they migrated for work, for education, they sought asylum, yeah, in some cases, and also for EU labor mobility. So legally, socially, and culturally, right, people like Saka, Mbappe, Bellingham, Rashford, etc., are players are the European, essentially European, even though they have African heritage. Because someone like Saka, he grew up in the Academo, in Arsenal Academy. He didn't grow up in Ibadan Academy. He didn't grow up in Lagos Academy. Saka grew up in Arsenal Academy. Saka don't know about Ibadan. They know about, Lagos. They don't know about Port Harcourt. He knows about London because that's where he was born. Mbappe doesn't know about Cameroon Academy or doesn't know about Algeria because he was born in Paris, the suburb, the banlieue, as they call them, in Paris, right? Or in terms of the Surinamese, Ajax Academy, or in Germany, the Bayern Academy, or in Portugal, the Sporting Academy, not in Hearts of Oak, AS Vita, Kotoko, Wydad, etc. So this pipeline, i.e. these African players, growing up in these academies, because when they're 6, 7, and 8, they're scouted for, and therefore, and if they're good, they go to these academies. that train and mold them. So that's the pipeline that shaped the national team. And so another reason why many Africans born in Europe play for those European countries as opposed to their mother countries is because of the infrastructure gap. Now, what do I mean by that? Check this now. Now, Europe offers elite academies like Arsenal, like Ajax, like Bayern Munich, etc., professional scouting, sports science, sports nutrition, injury management, data analysis and data analytics that is used to, improve a player's performance, world-class coaching, stable funding, and also guaranteed salaries. Africa, however, struggles with inconsistent funding, and we see that at major tournaments, particularly at World Cup. Remember Ghana, 2014 in Brazil, whereby they had to fly over, allegedly, $5 million to pay the Ghanaians team their bonus and their earnings. We've had similar instances with Nigeria and Cameroon. There's also corruption in some African football federations, like Ghana, Nigeria, like Cameroon. Poor facilities. So you can't compare the facility in somewhere like Ghana to England. Totally different. Because the Ghana FA, via the Ministry of Sports in Ghana, does not have enough money to funnel into the Ghana FA, and hence build, state-of-the-art, football centers, state-of-the-art football pitches, state-of-the-art sports science, injury management centers. But in Europe, they can do that. Yeah. So this is what I mean by poor facilities. Also in Africa, there's weak youth development. Yeah. And the big thing about Africa is political interference. Yeah. So we see that even in Ghana, you will get the ruling party sometimes interfere even in the selection of the local coach of the national team. Yeah. You don't get that in England or France or Germany. But in African countries, you do. Look at the other day in Cameroon, right? I think it was a couple of years ago. Samuel Eto'o got rid of Rigobert Song, the manager of Cameroon, because he didn't like Rigobert Song. That would happen in England or Germany or France. Yeah. There's also unreliable talent pathways. So in Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, Zimbabwe, Malawi, or have you, right? There is no pathway that a young aspiring footballer in Ghana, in Nigeria, in Kenya, Zimbabwe can go through. There's no under 8. There's no under 12. There's no under 15. There's no under 17. There's no under 20 pathway, unlike in France, Germany, England, etc., where a young talented footballer can pass through. It's either given the chance or, they bribe the parents, bribe the FA, whatever. Yeah. As I mentioned before, unpaid bonuses and also chaotic camp organization. We even saw this within Ghana, this World Cup, whereby they sacked Otoado 6 weeks before the tournament started. Yeah. And that brought the whole, Ghana preparation into chaos and shambolic. Yeah. So if you're a Ghanaian heritage child living in London, or you're a Nigerian heritage child born in Munich, or if you're a Congolese heritage child born in Lisbon, you are not going to choose a system that is chaotic and that is dysfunctional and that has got poor facilities. You would rather have a system that trains you, that feeds you, that develops your talent, that protects you from injuries via sports science and technologies, yeah, and more importantly, that invests in you. So you wouldn't choose Ghana, unfortunately. You wouldn't choose Ghana, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, DR Congo, etc. Yeah. So that explains why many Africans born in Europe, rather play for England, England, France, Switzerland, etc. And you see, even in Switzerland, right, they've got a lot of Africans in the team, like Imbolo, like Mazambi, like Vargas, who's mixed race, like Indoy, yeah? All Africans playing for Switzerland. Switzerland, beloved. Anyway, let's move on. Now, a key reason why many Africans decide to play for lots of England is about prestige politics. Now, check what I'm saying now. Check it out. Now, let's be honest with ourselves, right? Playing for England, France, Germany, Portugal, Belgium, or the Netherlands carries global prestige and global weight. Yeah. Now, what that means for an African footballer is potentially World Cup visiting, because it's more highly than likely that England, France, Germany, Portugal are going to qualify for the World Cup more often than DR Congo, who took 50 years to qualify for this year's World Cup, or Ghana, yeah, or Nigeria, or Zimbabwe. You get me? It means potentially more sponsorship deals. It also means elite medical support, something that African nations don't have, apart from Morocco. It means career protection, also guaranteed payments, unlike in African federations, and also high-level competition. Now, respectfully, playing for Ghana, Senegal, DR Congo, etc., is immensely powerful. However, the professional environment is very, very weak. Yeah, lack of proper elite training systems, lack of elite coaches, lack of elite sports science, technology, lack of elite sports nutrition. All this is lacking, yeah, within the African football federations. And so, because of this, African diaspora players know this, right? The agents know this, and a lot of the agents sway the players to play for England, etc. The clubs know this. So this is why the prestige of playing for the likes of England, Germany, France, Denmark, even Norway had two Africans on the pitch. Musa, yeah, Musa and Oscar Bob, two Africans playing for Norway, who made the quarterfinal of the World Cup. Yeah, this is why the prestige of playing for Europe, right, becomes so highly prized by these Africans born in Europe than playing for their mother countries. Now, a big one is corruption and distrust in African football federations. Yeah. Now, this is a sensitive part, but it's true. And we're going to tell you the truth, because what you say in the book, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall what? Set you free. So many diasporan players avoid African national teams because of favoritism. And we saw that in Ghana with particularly with the IU brothers, or even forget that. We saw that in Ghana, forget the IU brothers, we saw it in Ghana, particularly when, Ghana had that golden generation of Suleiman Tari, Stephen Appiah, Michael Essien and co. Yeah. Many diasporan Africans of Ghanaian heritage could not get in that team, even if they wanted to, because the Ghanaian FA, favored likes of Suleiman Tari, Stephen Appiah, etc., who were born in Ghana but plied their trade in Europe. Yeah. Also, bribery in selection. That's a big one amongst many African football federations. Political interference, as I mentioned, even within Ghana, right? There was, political interference in the sacking of Otto. Yeah, because Otto was brought in by the NPP, and when NDC came, particularly when he didn't perform in the Africa Cup of Nations qualifiers, which meant that Ghana did not qualify for this year's AFCON, that was reason enough to sack him. Days before or weeks before the World Cup. Yeah? That's reason for political interference within African football federations. Also, poor communication. unpaid bonuses, lack of professionalism, and weak medical setups, yeah, contribute and compel as to why many Africans born in the West would rather play for likes of England and Spain. And on that, Spain, you know, how many of you know Nico Williams, yeah, of Spain, the winger? He's of Ghanaian heritage. His mother Inaki plays for Ghana, but he chose to play for Spain, Nico. And the heir apparent, Lamine Yamal, mother from Equatorial Guinea, his name called Ebana, father Moroccan, yeah? So those two Africans play for Spain and are key members, particularly Lamine Yamal of the Spanish team, yeah? And hopefully we'll see Lamine Yamal in the final in the World Cup tomorrow, Sunday, the 19th. So, moving on, you know, we all know, you know, and this even feeds back to Africans in the diaspora, that the stories that go about saying that they didn't pick me because I didn't pay, or they lost my passport, or they didn't treat my injury properly, they called me the last minute, or they didn't organize anything. So whether every story is true or not, the perception of Africans in the diaspora have of their mother countries is powerful. Yeah, and perception can shape decisions. This is why it's even a young town like Kobemenu. Kobemenu should play for Ghana. But because of these nuances within the Ghana FA, a town like Kobemenu, whoever play for England, they play for Ghana. Or somebody like Saka, who's Nigerian. Because of these nuances, whoever probably play for England, they play for Nigeria. Yeah? So we now move on to a big one, identity. I'm European and African. Me personally, I don't buy that, but for the purposes of this podcast, we're going to use the two identities. I'm European and I'm African. Now check this. You know, players like Saka, Mbappe, Jude Bellingham, Jamal Musiala of Germany, Marco Olise, you know, Romelu Lukaku, etc. These players live in a dual identity. So somebody like Saka is culturally African. However, he's socially European because he hasn't lived in Nigeria for a long period of time. He's lived most of his life in London, in England. So he's socially European. He's legally English. Yeah, so he's got a British passport as opposed to a Nigerian passport. So he can play for England because he's legally born there and has a legal documentation. Yeah. He's emotionally mixed. What does that mean? So he's emotionally mixed. Saka is emotionally mixed because he has Nigerian heritage, but was born in London, England. Yeah. So I'm not sure if he's a bat and a gushy, but also, you know, he would like his fish and chips. That's what I mean by emotionally mixed. So for example, another examples. So Mbappe is French, but also by birth, but also Cameroonian and Nigerian by parents. Saka is English by birth, but has Nigerian parents. Musiala, German by birth, but has a Nigerian father. Lukaku, Belgian by birth, but Congolese by parents. Depay, Memphis Depay, born in Holland or the Netherlands, but has a Ghanaian father. Yeah, and Fernandez, born in Portugal, but has Cape Verdean parents. Yeah, so they love their heritage, right? But their lived reality is in that European country where they're born in. So again, we take Saka. Saka loves the Nigerian heritage, right? But the reality of Bukayo Saka is that he has lived the majority of his life in England, in London. He don't know a lot about Nigeria. He don't know a lot about Lagos. He don't know a lot about Ibadan. He don't know about his Igbo. He don't know much about Igbo culture. Yeah, because that's not what was, you know, instilled in him as a young boy. Yeah, the English culture, the English way of doing things. Yeah, the English mannerisms, the English characteristics is what shaped Saka. So Saka, you could say, is more English than he's Nigerian. Yeah. And so choosing Europe, right, or choosing England over Nigeria is not necessarily betrayal, it's identity. So Saka feels more English than just Nigerian. Mbappe feels more French than just for Cameroonian or Algerian. Congolese feels more French than just Nigerian. Lukaku feels more Belgium than Congolese. You understand the point I'm making? So this is why, again, many Africans will play for the European countries because they feel, Belgium or English or Dutch or French or Portuguese as compared to Ghanaian or Nigerian or Congolese or Kenyan or Zimbabwean, etc. Now, this is where it gets interesting. So you have all these African players playing for various European teams, right? But they all suffer from anti-Black racism. That's the big contradiction, right? And the compelling reason for me why Africans should not play for the teams. Now let me just, check this out. Now, Europe loves African players when they win. However, they racially abuse them when they lose. Now, we can give you many, many examples, but these are just a few to chew on. Now, when the French lost the semi-final to Spain, Mbappe was abused. And we also, even after the Paraguay game, one of the Paraguay ministers insulted Mbappe, saying that he's trying to be French, but really he's African, but someone trying to be French. It's a kind of paraphrase, yeah? And the Dutch players of African origin, like Virgil van Dijk, like Memphis Depay, like Somerville, yeah? So not Depay, like Somerville, like there's two of us, Somerville, not what's that guy's name? Guy used to play for Liverpool. No, not Ronaldo. Anyway, I can't remember the names, but those Dutch players those Africans who played for the Dutch were racially abused after they lost to Morocco. Jude Bellingham, right, was racially abused online, even though he became England's highest scorer in this tournament with 7 goals. And we all know what happened to England's African players after Euro 2021 when Bukayo Saka, Marcus Rashford, and De Santo all missed penalties. We know the vile anti-African online abuse that Saka, Rashford, and Sancho got after they missed penalties for England during their final defeat against Italy. So it shows you, right, the fragile acceptance, right, the African heritage players receive. So they're heroes when they're scoring goals, but the foreigners when they miss penalties. Yeah? So they're French when they're winning, but Africans win, they lose. So for example, the French team that won the World Cup in 2018, again, predominantly African team, Mbappe as a 19-year-old teenager, N'Golo Kante, Paul Pogba, Samuel Intiti, and many, many others African playing for the French team of that 2018. They were French, won the World Cup. But because they've lost, by this time round, because they lost in the semi-final against Spain, they're now Africans, they're not French. You see the hypocrisy and the double standards? It's like even England. When the white player like Harry Kane scores a goal, they all scream and shout. But when Bellingham scores, right, it's kind of muted. Yeah? So that's the contradiction, yeah, of the whole thing about Black footballers playing for these countries. And that's the contradiction, yeah, that the diaspora have got to face and experience. It's okay playing when you're winning, but when you're losing and not playing well, then you get all the racist, anti-African, anti-Black abuse. And so now, we move on to the next section. You know, why don't they switch to African countries? So all these Africans, like Saka, like Rashford, like Mbappe, like Lukaku, like Rafael Leao plays for Portugal. Why don't they switch to Africa? You'll be thinking to yourself. Now let me give you some key reasons why Africans in the diaspora hesitate. So one, fear of losing European club favour. Because let's not forget, the European clubs pay the wages predominantly of these Africans like Saka, Rashford, Mbappe, etc. Yeah. Fear of injury due to poor medical setups. So if a player was to play for Ghana, yeah, he wouldn't get the same medical expertise as playing for England or Germany. Also, there's a huge distrust of African football FA politics. I mentioned this time and time again. This is a big put-off, particularly a country like Ghana, where there's too much politics within the Ghanaian FA. Yeah, this puts off a lot of Ghanaians wanting to play for Ghana. Again, lack of competitive stability. A big one, lack of sports science. So you have countries like England, Germany, France, etc. They invest heavily in sports science. Compare that to countries like Ghana, Nigeria, DR Congo. That's not even looking at sports science or sports psychology. Yeah, lack of long-term planning is a big one. Because I mentioned in another podcast that Ghana, Morocco is not the standard bearer for Africa because they had a plan, a 20-year plan. So Morocco making the semi-final 4 years ago and making quarter-final this time round is not by accident. They had a plan 20 years ago, and that plan involved investing in elite coaches, sports nutrition, sports psychology, elite infrastructure, and that plan's now working and yielding fruit because Morocco is now the best team in Africa, even though they didn't officially win this year's AFCON. But the fact that they made the semi-final 4 years ago of the World Cup and quarterfinal this time round shows you how that investment has paid fruit. Now, if Ghana had done long-term planning, like what Morocco had done, Ghana should have used 2010, when they became the third African country after Senegal and Cameroon, to make the World Cup quarterfinal. Ghana should have invested this opportunity as a launching pad to invest in its future. And by now, that would have yielded fruit. And Ghana would be in much better position than they are now. Yeah? So this lack of long-term planning and stability is another reason why you won't get these African players born in Europe, right, to play for them other countries. We all know there's also pressure from the agents, majority of whom are white, to play for England, Germany, Switzerland, then play for Ghana, Nigeria, DR Congo. There's also pressure from European clubs, and there's also the prestige, as they would see it, of European national teams, despite the anti-Black racism. So it's not lack of patriotism, because like I said, Saka loves his Nigerian heritage. However, as he would say, it's lack of trust in, for example, the Nigerian Football Federation. And so, in closing, the future. Can Africa become its diaspora? Can Africa really do it? Well, it can, but if African Football Federation becomes more professional, more scientific, more trustworthy, well-funded, and that's where the CAF comes into it, Confederation of African Football, yeah, because we know that some of the money that CAF gets is a bit dubious and doesn't get into the football federations of the various African countries, yeah. That in turn needed to be well organized, corruption-free, and also modern. So like I said before, Morocco is the blueprint, yeah? But Senegal is also improving, fast improving, which is why a lot of Senegalese even though some of them were born in France, you know, Italy or Germany, a lot of them want to play for Senegal because Senegal now is following the plan that Morocco has. Nigeria is also beginning to look at the diaspora talent. Ghana is trying to rebuild. So the future depends on African football federations getting the house in order and fixing their systems that will enable the likes of Kobemenu, of Saka, of Elise to play for these countries. So in closing, you know, Africa has got a talent, yeah? But why do Africans play for Europe? Europe built systems. Africa didn't. Because Europe invested in its academies. Africa didn't. Because Europe offers stability and continuity. Africa doesn't. Because Europe offers prestige. Africa doesn't. Because Europe offers trust. Africa doesn't. However, the story isn't over. Africa can build world-class football. Africa can become its diaspora. Africa can create systems worthy of its talent. The question is not why Africans play for Europe. The question should be, when will Africa build a football system worthy of its children? That is the question that in private, likes of Kabemenu, Saka, and others talk about. When will Africa build a football system worthy of its children that I can play for Ghana, for Nigeria, for DR Congo, etc.? And so, this is a question that will need to be asked by these African football federations. And for me, if an African team is going to win the World Cup, it must have a collection of Africans born in those particular countries. Also, Africans born, in Europe. So, for example, Ghana. If Ghana is going to succeed in the future, it must have a mix of Ghanaians born in Ghana, but also Ghanaians born in the UK, Germany, what have you. Yeah, to create an eclectic mix of Ghanaian brotherhood and spirithood. But also Ghana must improve, like all the other African federations, its systems of management, of sports science, of infrastructure, of elite coaches, etc. If that does happen, no African team will ever win the World Cup, probably outside Morocco. So thank you for listening to this edition of the African Football Podcast with myself, Kwame, Ghanaian writer, broadcaster, historian, entrepreneur, and podcaster. In next week's edition, we're not talking football, but we will do probably at some point again. But next week's issue, we'll be talking about the recent floods happening in Ghana, particularly Accra, and tell you who's to blame and why, if nothing's done, Accra could submerge, and I mean submerge underwater, literally. And so until next week, thank you for listening to the African Football Podcast over the last few weeks. And if you like what you hear, please share to your friends, your family, social media networks. Subscribe to Ghana African Focus on YouTube. Subscribe to Ghana African Focus on Spotify. All right, so until next week, thank you very much for listening. And we'll see you for some more Africa, Ghana in Focus.